Are you bored with heat embossing? Well, get your guns out because we're going to step it up today with 4 techniques. And if you stick around, I've got a bonus idea for you. So we're going to start with the first technique, which is to use a 3D embossing folder. This is probably the easiest of all the techniques to do, and you can use any design embossing folder that you have. I do like the look of the 3D embossing folders because they have a little bit more depth and dimension to them. And you can change this up to look quite different depending on which embossing folder you use, which embossing powder you use, and how much ink you add. It can give you a totally different look. Today I'm going to step it up a little bit and I'm going to be using some textured, more chunky and glittery style embossing powders, and these have their own little bit of a learning curve with them, but I'm going to walk you through it. Now you will need an embossing ink. There are many fabulous ones on the market. You just find one that works for you. So these are a clear sticky ink that will hold on to the embossing powder and give you time to hit it with your heat tool and melt it onto your design. So with the embossing folder panel that I've made, I'm literally just wiping the embossing ink over the raised portion of this. And I did hit it pretty hard because I know that I'm using this sort of more fuller kind of embossing powder. And to get those chunks and the bits of glitter to stick, I knew I'd need that little bit more stick from the embossing ink. If you're using a regular style embossing powder, you probably could get away with less ink. And it doesn't really matter for a design like this anyway, because this is actually going to be the background of the cards. So the embossing powder here itself has a base color of white, so that's perfect on a white background. So that means that if it's uneven, it's really not going to be noticed, because once I melt the embossing powder, then that white embossing powder on the white background isn't going to show too badly. But before we go on, I just want to do a really quick shout out to Oz Trinklets and Crafts, who have sourced a dual speed heat tool here in Australia with an Australian power connection. I know it doesn't sound huge to some people in other countries, but in the past we've had to buy our tools from the UK if we want like a dual speed one. We've had to buy it from the UK and then get either use like a travel adapter or get the power plug changed. And I really do not like the idea of running a heat tool through a power adapter. So to have one that's going to fit into an Australian PowerPoint is awesome. So when I added the embossing powder onto this panel, I did tap away some of the excess. The trouble with glitter powders is that if you tap too much, you can often tap away the bits that you want to keep. So if you think about that, if you hit it with a heat tool, it's probably going to blow away, or it does, blow away the bits of glitter and some of the chunks of embossing powder that you want to keep to add the magic in these kind of powders. So my top tip here is to start your heat embossing from beneath the panel. Now, I struggle with this because I'm so used to heat embossing just from the top that when I'm heat embossing from underneath, I've been known to, create just a little bit of smoke once or twice perhaps. I've never caught anything alight, but it is something to be aware of. It's harder to judge the distance from the panel, but if you do it often enough, you're going to get used to it. But do keep a close eye on it if you are heating from the reverse side. So once it's kind of started to melt, then it is pretty safe to flip the gun over and start heat embossing from the top. So make sure it's just like regular heat embossing here. If there are any patchy areas that don't have that bit of a shine to them, then you can always reheat them with the tool. You just don't want to overheat it and lose the shine. So rather than adding the ink to the embossed side, why not try adding the ink to the debossed side? It's going to give you a totally different look. Or you could even try using coloured cardstock or multiple colours of embossing powder. So we're on to technique number 2, and this time we're going to be using stencils and textures. So a company called Wow specialise in embossing powders and they have this set of 3 different powders, and it comes with some empty jars so you can make up your own combinations, but they add like a texture or a sheen or a glisten to any embossing powder that you may have. Now the embossing powder that I've chose to use here is a super fine one, and I think because I'm adding texture, if I had used a regular sort of embossing powder, so something that's going to raise up probably a little bit more on the cardstock than a super fine one will, I think the effect would have been more dramatic, and it was hard to take photographs of this, but it definitely made a huge difference to this powder. So I just added equal portions and mixed them together in an empty jar. I didn't make much because with embossing powder you really don't need to use much at all. Now I've inked up a layered flower here, and because this is an inked panel, to test whether it is still going to like the embossing powder is going to stick where I don't want, I've just used a powder bag and ran some white embossing powder, just tipped it over top to see where it was going to sort of hit. But this is where the dual speed heat tools really come in handy. I never thought I'd use the low speed as much as I do, but one of the great reasons to use it, other than drying watercolor that is to help dry ink a little bit quicker, because you really don't want to have a high speed heat tool hitting a panel of ink. It can warp it and it can be annoying. All right, so I'm using one of the layered stencils here, like of the center of the flower, and I've added my textured embossing powder, the one that I created myself, to the center. I used just a dauber. You can use the actual ink pad itself, like the embossing ink pad, and just sort of squish that through the stencil. But you'll probably find if you use something like a dauber, you're going to get a better, more even coverage of the ink. I did have to do this in sections because I needed to make sure that each portion was heat set before I did the second layer. And wouldn't this look amazing done with like a whole background stencil? Speaking of background stencils, we're on to our third technique now, and this time we're going to be using no ink at all. In fact, the next 2 techniques don't use any embossing ink at all. We're going to be using embossing paste. So I've chosen a fun pattern. You can do this in whatever pattern you like, and with whatever embossing paste you have as well. I wanted to make all my cards matchy-matchy, which is what I tend to do. So I've chosen a pearl embossing paste, so something that's very light coloured, but it would have looked lovely in gold as well. But I started with the pearl, and then you just add the embossing paste as you regularly would. Now what's happening here is we're going to be using the embossing paste itself to adhere the embossing powder to. Because we've got no embossing ink at play here, this is wet enough to hold the embossing powder in place so that we can heat set it. One thing to be aware of is that you are using heat here, so we do want to heat set the embossing powder, but we also kind of dry the embossing paste at the same time. And if you overheat it, there is the potential to cause some bubbling in the embossing paste, which can look amazing if that's the look that you want. It gives it a little bit more dimension, and it can be kind of, I don't know, funky and fun in a design. Now there are a ton of different embossing powders to choose from, as well as a ton of different embossing pastes to choose from, so the possibilities really are endless here. I've used the light colour, and I've chosen like a rose gold for this one, and this is also on a white base. So these powders are a combination of powders designed by Jo Herbert, who's an amazing paper crafter, and I will link her. She's got a YouTube channel and a blog. I'll link it in the description below because you've got to check her out. She's also from Australia and an awesome chick. And you just do exactly the same technique where you add the embossing powder and tap off any excess. Other ideas for the embossing paste here is to create like almost an abstract splashy background. You could use a palette knife and just do a really thin layer of embossing paste on a piece of cardstock and then add the embossing powders over top and get a really funky look. It doesn't have to be a background. You could also use a layering stencil with this embossing paste technique and get that extra bit of dimension with the embossing paste and with the embossing powder. So when I was heat setting this panel with the embossing paste, I used the low setting. I know it took me a little bit longer to do, but I think it was worth it. I didn't want that bubbly look with the embossing paste, and I did start on the reverse, like holding the heat tool behind the panel first, just to make sure I didn't blow off any of the glittery bits. But to be honest, I think they probably would have stayed pretty well because they would have stuck to the embossing paste. But I did come back with the heat tool and hit the front of the panel just to make sure that the embossing paste was fully heat set. So this is a fun one. No embossing ink in sight here either. This time we're going to be using double-sided tape to adhere the embossing powder to. I've chosen a nice strong double-sided tape. I thought some nice wide stripes would be really funky, and I've just added them to some 80-pound cardstock, so it's not a very heavyweight cardstock here. You could cut this specifically to fit. I decided instead to add some powder tool to the reverse side of the tape and then cut the excess away with my scissors. It was still a bit sticky. I really need to lash out and buy a new powder tool. There's hardly any brush left on the end of mine. And then literally just remove the release paper and add the embossing powder as you would if you'd used embossing ink to create the stripes. One awesome feature of doing this technique was that I found very little movement of this chunky embossing powder and the glitter. It really held in place extremely well, and this would be a really good way to create a whole background panel using the embossing powder if you want to do some die cutting with it. If you do have any excess strays, the best time to remove them is before you do the heat setting. It's much easier to do that than try and scratch it away after, although you can. So initially I did start the heat embossing from the reverse side, and I just found it wasn't shifting at all on the front, so I decided to heat set it from the front and didn't have a problem at all. It was great. And on this panel you can really see the dimension that these embossing powders give. This is the gold based one again. It's just beautiful. I would be careful to try not to overheat the tape though, because there is a chance that it may lift off the cardstock. Imagine this done in multiple colours, all different embossing powders on each stripe. You could also use variation in the stripe widths. You could also crisscross them. How fun would that be? So we're going to turn these 4 backgrounds into cards now. But first, I did promise you a bonus technique. Did you know that you can double heat emboss? I've chosen 2 of the layers here for the center of the flower. So one of the things to note is you need to choose a larger surface area for your first layer of heat embossing, and I typically will do that in a lighter color embossing powder. So I've used the Dauber again to add the Versamark ink or the embossing ink to the center, and I did make sure that the image was cooled before I added the second layer of embossing ink using one of the smaller sections of the stencil. It can be a little bit slippery to add the second layer of embossing ink because you've got the heat embossed section, so just be careful not to shift the stencil if you possibly can, and that's where the Dauber comes in really handy. Then add a darker color of embossing powder and heat set it with your tool, being careful not to overheat it, because if you do, both the powders will mix and melt together, which could look amazing too. But it's such a fun technique and something that I don't do often enough. So this stencil set has a coordinating die. If I'm going to pop anything up, I always add a second layer of scrap cardstock die cut as well, and then I can just join them together. Just adds a bit of stability, and I know that the image isn't going to get too smashed up when it goes through the post. I decided to cut the panel down a little bit. This is my very first panel with the 3D embossing folder, and it's going to create a beautiful background for my flower. And for two reasons, I've added some liquid glue to the foam tape behind my flower. That is to help me reposition the flower until I'm sort of happy with the placement on my card front. But I also know that it's going to help get a stronger hold with that glitter embossing powder that's in the background. So I've used this same flower on all of the cards and in different ways. And it's nice to show how the same bouquet can look different when you set it up differently on your card designs. All together now, our first technique where we used the 3D embossing folder and swiped the embossing ink over top. This has also got the bonus technique where we did the double heat embossing in the center of the flower. The second technique where I did the embossing through a stencil, but we added some texture to the embossing powder to give it a different look and feel. Our third technique, which was to use embossing paste. So no embossing ink inside here. We used embossing paste to adhere the embossing powder to and created a fun background. And the final card where we used double-sided tape to create a beautiful, fun striped background, and no embossing ink inside here either. Let me know in the comments below if you have a favorite card today, and if you're going to try any of these techniques, make sure you share them with me at social media. I love to see what you make using these ideas. And if this is a little bit too daunting, don't worry. I'm going to link a video here where I share a ton of tips for heat embossing on different surfaces and how to use it in card making. So I look forward to seeing you there. And if you did like today's video, don't forget to click on the thumbs up button. And if you haven't already, subscribe. What are you waiting for? It's totally free. I look forward to seeing you back here again real soon. Till then, happy paper crafting. Bye.